I'd like to introduce Erin Finney. She lives nearby with her husband Mark and daughter Annabelle, and they have been coming to this church for many years now. And Erin has served as treasurer on the board. And by day, she's a psychologist, and in her free time, she enjoys traveling, music, animals, learning new languages, and discovering the inner workings of the universe. Welcome, Erin.
So, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming out to hear me talk. And I also want to give out a shout out to those who are listening in the future because we're recording this. So, hello to everybody who's listening in the future too. So, I'm Erin Finney, and most of you probably know I'm a psychologist. So I spend a lot of time listening to people. I got the idea for this talk while listening to someone else's talk here a couple months ago. I'd like to share some stories I found interesting about some different types of listening and listeners. I'd like to reflect some about what makes listening and understanding possible, and also look a little at what keeps us from listening sometimes. Okay, so I want to talk about trees for a moment. And you thought I was going to talk about people listening to each other, didn't you? Well, I will get to that later. As it turns out, trees are excellent listeners. They can also share their resources, give preferential treatment to their own young, and pass down tree wisdom through their root networks as they are dying. They make sounds that are outside the range human ears can discern, and they send their messages across vast root networks. So I found a TED Talk by a woman named Suzanne Simard, who is a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia. So her work has been demonstrating that these complex symbiotic networks in our forests mimic our own neural and social networks as people. She found that using an underground root system coupled with a symbiotic fungal root system, the mycorrhizal system, paper birch trees and Douglas fir trees in this forest network communicate in two-way conversations using the language of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, hormones, water, and defense signals. Their network is busiest around hub trees, or as they're called in the forest, mother trees. The mother trees nurture the younger trees, giving them biochemical resources, space to grow. They actually reduce their own root footprint to do this, and tree wisdom. So the mother trees are able to differentiate which saplings are biologically theirs, apart from other saplings, even from the same species. And so they send their own saplings more resources. They can increase the survival rate of the young trees by about 4 times. When the mother trees are injured or dying, they send carbon and defense signals to the younger trees with instructions for resisting future stressors. So through these back and forth conversations in their root networks, they increase the resilience of the whole community. So I thought that was pretty neat. The idea that communication can strengthen a whole community, even if it's trees. So following up on this, Monica Gagliano of the University of Western Australia's Centre for Evolutionary Biology was examining whether plants can tune in to sound when seeking water. So her plant cognition researcher team found that plant root systems travel toward water sources by sensing acoustic vibrations. So the team played water flowing through a sink and then a recording of the same sound to common pea plants with roots separated in tubes. And so they examined how the roots responded. So the root systems did not grow as well toward the recorded sound, but did grow toward the actual water sounds flowing through a real sink. So they could distinguish between the fake water sounds and the real thing. That's pretty cool. Given that there's no actual moisture in the soil, they're listening. So they responded to the sounds rather than the presence of moisture, as if they could feel sound. So not only that, when water was available from natural resources in the soil, and the water was still flowing from the sink, the roots still grew toward their natural source. So this sounds like the plants made a choice. Until now, it wasn't clear how plant roots located their water sources when no moisture is in the soil. It was thought that plants travel toward water using sonic vibrations initially, but then the roots make choices targeting the better source by determining moisture levels. So what does it take for plants to listen and communicate? Rather than just one simple answer, it seems as they listen and converse biochemically, acoustically, genetically even, and with helpers like the fungal networks of the forests. So then that brought me to Alex Metcalf, who is a tree listener. So he was studying for a master's in product design at the Royal College of Art this was also Australia, in 2005. And so he wondered whether it was possible to hear the inner workings of a tree. So he designed and built a tree listening instrument. And I wanted to show you a picture of it, but we couldn't get the picture up. So it looks like a little horn, like a really simple trumpet with like a smaller end for your ear and then a larger end for the tree. And, you know, as I was looking at that picture, I was like, oh, that reminds me of the Pinard horn. Does anybody know what a Pinard horn is? So I wish I could show you a picture of that too, because they're really similar looking things. But so the Pinard horn was invented by Dr. Adolphe Pinard, who was a French obstetrician during the 19th century. So he was an early supporter of advancements in prenatal care. And so an experienced listener or midwife or doctor could use the Pinard horn to listen to the fetal heartbeat and would determine a baby's positioning inside the mother based on what sounds they could hear from the heartbeat. They still use these around the world, but less so in the USA now because we use Doppler field monitors instead. So anyway, back to trees. So Alex Metcalf is listening to his trees, and I want to quote something from him. So you'll hear a quiet popping sound that is produced by the water passing through the cells of the xylem tubes and cavitating as it mixes with air on its way upwards. In the background is a loud, deep rumbling noise that is produced by the tree moving and vibrating. This water movement that keeps the tree alive by providing the leaves with the necessary water to turn into sugar as a source of food and as part of its cooling system on a hot, sunny day. So I wish I could get an audio file of this sound to share with you, but I couldn't. So I'd like to read it again. And after that, I want you to all take a moment and just imagine what this might sound like. So we're going to imagine listening to this tree. So the water is passing through the cells of the xylem tubes and cavitating. It's mixing with air. And in the background, there's a loud, deep rumbling noise that is produced by the tree moving and vibrating. So be quiet for a moment. Okay, so Alex was working on his tree listening project between 2005 and 2009. A few years later, scientists at Grenoble University in France, led by physicist Alexander Ponomarenko, were able to build on his work using simulated trees, observing the cavitations or the air bubble flow restrictions, and other activity at the same time the sounds are being recorded. So cross-referencing the visual and audio data, they were able to distinguish the sounds that corresponded with cavitation from other sounds, such as fractures in the wood. So they're now using this information to start to understand the different sounds associated with the healthy conditions, warning signs, and then also drought conditions. So now we're eavesdropping on trees and learning from them. First, we discover we can listen. We discover they're talking to each other, and then we can work on understanding some piece of the message that they're sharing. It's pretty neat. So next, I'd like to take us to Tibet. So I happened across this book while I was in like an artsy little bookstore a little while ago. So its title is The Spiritual Medicine of Tibet. And it's co-written by Dr. Pema Dorji, Janet Jones, and Terrence Moore. So Tibetan medicine is a spiritual medical system based on the fundamental laws of the universe. It reflects the workings of nature, which apply to everything and everyone across the planet. Central to the Tibetan medicine is Buddha's idea that suffering can be alleviated and its root cause transformed if we can control the mind. Dr. Pema Dorji writes, quote, "The mind sits at the heart of everything, the prime mover of our body toward a state of health or disease. The mind is the state of consciousness at any one particular moment in time. It is not simply the engine of thought, but is the summation of all of our inner impulses, thoughts, fears, desires, aspirations, emotions, reactions, and sensitivities to everything around us." End quote. Dr. Carl Jung, a well-respected Western psychologist, stated that, open quote, "Whatever darkness we are unable to face ourselves will manifest on the outside. During times of crisis, political or otherwise, balance is held and the problem contained in direct relation to the people strong enough to face their inner selves and not be swayed by the outer masses." So as I was reading this quote, close quote, I was, reflecting on the coronavirus and, that particular crisis that we're facing. It feels like these days the crises come fast and furious, and before we can finish, wrapping our minds around and resolving one crisis, the next is already at our doorstep. So these were nice words for me to read from Dr. Jung, considering the idea that, even in the face of all these crises, we have to do our part individually to retain what balance we can. So in this book, they talk about this conference called the Rainbow Conference that they held in Switzerland with a number of Tibetan doctors and also spiritual leaders and healers from all over the place. And so one of these Tibetan doctors was Dr. Tenzin Chodrak, who suffered 20 years of torture and suffering in Tibet at the hands of the Chinese. But then he was relatively recently reinstated in India as the personal physician to the Dalai Lama. So he's been trained in the Chatpuri lineage, known for its unique tradition of combining medicine and spirituality. So Dr. Chodrak lectured at the conference on the 3 mental poisons that contribute to suffering. And so he categorized these as desire, anger, and closed-mindedness. And so from these 3 poisons sprang 3 physical energies. And I don't know how to pronounce these. So Arlong, or wind, Tripa, or bile, and Badkan, or phlegm. So the energy of Arlong relates to the element of wind and was responsible for different kinds of movement within the body, including the pulsation of blood within the body. Okay, so I found this really interesting. So the Tibetan doctors take a person's pulse, and rather than just take the pulse, they sit there and they listen for quite a long time. And so I want to quote something that they wrote in this book. So, "The whispering pulse was like a messenger for those who had the touch, and in that touch there was an answer to the calling from the patient's inner universe, a web of fine connections streaming on up to the skin. To touch the skin and read the pulse, the slender fingers of the doctor were all ears. They listened in and reached down into the blood to hear the beat of the heart, the beat of the lungs, the beat of liver and gallbladder, the beat of spleen, stomach, kidney, bladder, large and small intestines, and the reproductive organs. Every organ in the body fed the rhythm of the pulse. This melody of the blood was rich in information, for a disease would manifest as an obstruction in the system, and by transmission to the pulse produce a kind of echo, a particular sensation sliding underneath the fingers of the doctor, informing him of everything. A physician must develop his capacity for sensitivity to such a very high degree that even if he were only to be presented with a patient's hand, with the rest of the person concealed by a curtain, he could nevertheless arrive at a reliable diagnosis of the condition. Pulse taking is the keystone of the traditional Tibetan diagnosis. Of course, a good Tibetan doctor will also read the signs of every person who approached for treatment, from the foot upon the stair to the knock upon the door, the physician would be completely attentive, absorbing everything about the coming patient, already pervading the atmosphere like a fragrance. The way in which the patient entered, how he or she sat upon the seat, all these subtle but revealing external signs were inevitable reflections of the inner state of the patient. All the answers lay there waiting to be found, for they were tuning into the workings of the universe. End quote. So this is fascinating to me. So the idea that, a Tibetan doctor can listen and observe to this extent, to observe a person walk in and to see everything that comes in with them, to take this pulse and listen to all the comings and goings of, blood vessel, the blood flow, and that all these messages could be carried from all the organs. It's a fascinating idea. Okay. So apparently there are 7 types of, the title is 7 Amazing Pulses. We read a little bit from, well, I'll just tell you the types because I don't want to go into too much. Okay. So 7 amazing pulses. So there's the pulse of the family. So by taking the pulse of one person in the family, you can tap into what's going on with the rest of the family members. The pulse of the guest could determine the fate of an unexpected friend or guest. The pulse of the enemy was consulted as a means of divination in ancient times by examining the commander of an army facing battle. But in general, it could be used to see if one would be successful in the accomplishment of one's aims. The pulse of wealth could be found within the pulse of the head of the household. The pulse of demons or malefic influences would be taken when a person was being affected in a most unusual manner. And the 6th pulse, known as the reversing pulse, was consulted to determine the state of a loved one or family member who could not be examined directly. So this commonly happened in mountainous areas where someone was too ill to travel to the doctor. So the reversing pulse of a family member could not by itself reveal the exact nature of the disease, but would determine the prognosis and then assist in prescribing the appropriate form of treatment. The pulse of the father examined could help with the health of the son. The pulse of the mother could help treat the daughter, and so on. And the final pulse is the pulse of pregnancy, and is described as moving like a caterpillar. The pulse assisted in predicting any problems within childbirth and could give an indication as to any difficulties in raising the child, its future prosperity, and indicating the sex of the child. So that is very interesting to me that you can, or that these doctors were able to determine such a wide variety of information, still just taking one person's pulse about, their extended network. It sounds a lot to me like the tree network that I was talking about at the beginning. So I'd like us to pause for a moment and consider. So let's imagine we're each listening to our own pulse. So I'll be quiet for a moment, and in that moment, I'd like you to see if you can attend to the beat of your own heart and imagine all the information it contains, right? You listen to that blood flow, what the organs might be saying. Imagine the people connected to you in your network, like your own forest. So I'll be quiet for a moment here. Okay. Thanks for playing along. So the next thing I want to talk about are people who are hard of hearing. So deaf people can still sense vibration in the part of the brain that other people use for hearing. So this helps explain how deaf musicians can sense music and how deaf people can enjoy concerts and other musical events. So Dr. Dean Shibata is an assistant professor of radiology at the University of Washington. So he says, open quote, "These findings suggest that the experience deaf people have when feeling music is similar to the experience other people have when hearing music. The perception of the musical vibrations by the deaf is likely every bit as real as the equivalent sounds, since they're ultimately processed in the same part of the brain. The brain is incredibly adaptable. In someone who is deaf, the young brain takes advantage of valuable real estate in the brain, by processing vibrations in the part of the brain that would otherwise be used to process sound. So just because you don't have, end quote. So just because you don't have the mechanics to hear the sound that the hearing world does, your brain, that real estate still exists, and it's going to get repurposed to different types of input that you can give to your brain. How fascinating. So Dr. Shibata performed research while he was on the faculty at the University of Rochester School of Medicine. So he ran a study in which deaf students and hearing volunteers completed functional magnetic resonance imaging to compare brain activity. So they had 10 volunteers from the college and 10 volunteers from the college with hearing impairment and 11 volunteers with normal hearing. So they were subjected to intermittent vibrations on their hands as they were doing the fMRI. Both groups showed brain activity in the part of the brain that normally processes vibrations. But in addition, the deaf students showed brain activity in a golf ball-sized area, the auditory cortex, otherwise usually only active during auditory stimulation. The people with normal hearing did not show such brain activity. Dr. Shibata says, open quote, "These findings illustrate how altered experience can affect brain organization. It was once thought that brains were just hardwired at birth, and particular areas of the brain always did one function, no matter what else happened. It turns out that, fortunately, our genes do not directly dictate the wiring of our brains. Our genes do provide a developmental strategy that all the parts of the brain will be used to maximal efficiency." How cool, right? So there's something up there that if some part of your brain gets damaged or if something isn't working right, your brain will reorganize itself to a certain extent to help compensate for what's missing and to help you keep living your life even though, something is a little bit off. So, all this left me just thinking about listening and communication. What does it really take to listen? So, first off, I think it takes a certain willingness to attend to an experience deeply, to really dive in. I think in our world where we're rushing here and there and, we consume a lot of different media and a lot of experiences, sometimes it can be kind of rare that we sit with an experience and just, let it permeate ourselves. But sometimes it takes that level to really hear all the subtle messages, all the very quiet nuances that are there. So perhaps it takes a little bit of freedom from distraction or agreeing to not be distracted for a time. Sometimes it takes specialized equipment or training, like in the case of our tree listening horns and the Pidar horn, or the training that these Tibetan doctors undergo for, years and years and years to listen to a person's pulse. To really hear well and understand the message, it seems to take a lot of practice. And sometimes it seems we need to differentiate what is extra noise and what is the real message, because sometimes the extra noise covers up the message. Perhaps it also takes us knowing and confronting difficult things within ourselves. Some of the things we listen to might be uncomfortable. Maybe there are some of these things that are truths we're not quite ready to hear. Perhaps it takes a certain amount of unattachment or detachment from the message to be able to listen to it and take it for what it is, knowing that, some of the message may hurt, but there it is. If we hear something we don't like, how do we handle it? So, what are the barriers to successful listening? The list here could be long. So, right. I'm sure you've experienced, especially on the internet, a lot of lack of listening. It's tough to hear people with different viewpoints. Sometimes it's hard to hear the quietest voice in a room when everyone else is willing to shout. Anyway, so questions I have for you. So what does it take you all to really listen? And what are some of the barriers that make it more difficult for you to listen in when you really want to? So that is all I have for today. I'll open it up to questions, comments, whatnot, and thank you for listening.